My guest is here. Yes, excellent. I would like to introduce and to bring in somebody that I have followed for a while now, and he has my deep appreciation for joining me, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Thank you, man, for joining me. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing okay. Hope you are too.
I am doing great. Better that you're joining me. And just to give you a bio, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He is a distinguished visiting professor of government and public policy at College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. He also taught for 6 years at the University Honors Program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He is also, and probably best known as the retired United States Army Colonel and former Chief of Staff for the United States Secretary of State, Colin Powell. Man, you have no idea how much I appreciate you joining me on this show. Thank you for this.
Good to be with you.
I am going to start off at the very beginning, considering what the news that have been passed down over the weekend with Joe Biden approving missile strikes or long-range missile strikes in Russia proper. And of course, the reason this is a big deal is because Putin has already pointed out that this is a red line and that doing this will mean that Russia is at war with NATO and that they will find ways to respond, whether that's, hey, Houthis, here's a hypersonic bomb, have fun, or whether that's assisting in elements either in Syria or in the Middle East, we don't know. But they made it very clear this was a red line. Why do you think Joe Biden is doing this? Give me your take on this.
I hate to say it, but I've known Joe Biden long enough to know that one of his most disturbing characteristics when he is angry is spite. He's a very spiteful man when he gets angry. You may recall his words at the hearings when Anita Hill was testifying, and he's in the other party. He's a Democrat, and she, of course, was representing H.W. Bush's nomination for the Supreme Court, and Biden just treated her like she was dirt. And I think that was a reflection, personality reflection, if you will, of this kind of spite. Now he's feeling real spite because, one, he was eliminated by his arch rival, if you will, Barack Obama, is what I'm told, who made the major, vote breaking recommendation that he stepped down in favor of his vice president, which really angered him. Again, I'm told, I wasn't there, but it fits my picture of Joe Biden's character. And he's been angry ever since. And he's also angry that the Democrats lost and that any implication for that loss might adhere to him for the wars in Ukraine, the unparalleled support for the genocide in Gaza, and other things that really turned a lot of people off, particularly progressives who probably refused to even vote. So he's in a mood to leave Trump with a legacy that Trump will find very difficult to deal with. And he's also trying to, I think, seal the deal, if you will, with Zelensky and Ukraine so that Trump will find it extremely difficult to get out. After all, if Putin attacks a NATO country or NATO countries, then all bets are off. Then we're in a war, however stupid and unwise it is, we're in a war alongside other NATO countries against Russia. So these are all things that probably impacted his decision. And meanwhile, he's down in Brazil, in the rainforest, declaring things. If I were President Lula, I would have arrested him as a war criminal and presented him to the International Criminal Court and told them, over to you, justice.
It's astonishing to me that that level of spite allows Joe Biden to potentially risk a third world war. I mean, because either one of a few things is true. Either he believes Putin is bluffing, which I don't know why you would think Putin is bluffing at this point. I mean, they've been in a war, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Bluffing is not really something I think would happen at this point. Or he wants to, as you said, ingratiate the U.S. even further into a war to make it that much more difficult for Trump to extricate himself from it. That just seems very, to call it risky is an understatement. I guess from my point of view, what do you think the Pentagon is saying on this? Because the Pentagon had disagreed with this premise. From their point of view, you're not going to really get anything out of it, but you're risking an uncontrolled war, or for that matter, unpredictable consequences for doing so. So it's not, it's like, it's not much juice out of that orange. And yet it seems that the president is pushing for it anyway. Give me a take on how you think this is going to be received. I mean, how do you think Putin is going to resolve or deal with this?
Well, this Pentagon, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown, Air Force General C.Q. Brown, and Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, of course, have been the brake on our war in Ukraine, if you will. They've been very much the brake, and I don't think this is going to make them happy at all. In fact, I suspect they're pondering what this means at the Pentagon. And they're probably on the line. Lloyd Austin has a pretty good line into his equivalent in Russia. So he's probably talking to him. Thank God we've got someone who essentially evades Biden's order that no one of his cabinet talk to Russia. He's probably talking to them, and he's trying to calm the waters a bit. Now, Putin has been very circumspect and very prudent. I just listened a moment ago to his latest remarks. And he was very circumspect. He was very prudent, but he was very, very definitive too, declarative, if you will, about this being an escalation, a sure escalation, if it were to happen. Putin has at his beck and call missiles that are the equivalent of nuclear weapons, but without the fallout. He has some missiles, the Avant-Garde series, for example, even the Iskander series, that have such colossal warheads on them. And in the case of the Avant-Garde, move at 33,000 kilometers per hour. That's about 19,000 miles an hour. That's a fast missile. There's no way anyone in the world can shoot it down. And when it hits with that speed and the size of its conventional warhead, it has the impact on the ground of a small yield nuclear weapon without the radioactivity. So he's already shot one of those, you may recall. He shot it at that facility that was deep inside Ukraine that had a lot of people from NATO in it training Ukrainians.
That's right.
Yeah, those were the first bodies the Swiss had shipped home in body bags in decades, if not a century. So it was a real shock for the Swiss. I'm not the Swiss, the Swedish.
Yeah.
Thank God the Swiss are smart enough not to be in there. So that was, we could do that on a more wholesale basis and devastate Ukraine, particularly Kyiv, if he wanted to. Probably take out Zelensky and his whole government if he wanted to. So I would think he would probably move to that next rather than nuclear weapons, but there's always the possibility, and that's a very dangerous possibility.
Let me ask you this. I've asked people who've come onto the show, what was this for? And the reason I ask this question is I find this to be so unnecessary as a war. I mean, if you think about it, there were the Minsk agreements. NATO expanded literally to the border of Russia at this point, knocks over the government of Ukraine. All of these things are hostile actions. There were Minsk agreements 1 and 2. There were Istanbul agreements that were blown off. The Minsk agreements, you had Angela Merkel coming out basically saying we lied. And so an agreement that was supposedly used to end a conflict was effectively used to provoke one, to allow Ukraine to build up this massive military. And I think of all these people that have lost their lives, and this war at some point is going to come to an end. Ukraine is clearly going to lose the war. And I think at some point, someone is going to have to ask the question, either in the United States or Ukraine, what was this for? And so I'm asking you, and I don't mean like we are stopping Putin from, using 150,000 troops to take all of Europe. I don't mean that. The U.S. clearly had some kind of geopolitical strategic reason for doing this. What was it for?
I think there were 3 reasons for what we did in Ukraine, and you've just described it rather well. I'm not excusing Putin's violation of an international border in any way, but I am saying he had more than adequate provocation to do so, and we gave him that provocation. The first and most important strategic reason for the United States, and this is the neoconservatives who fostered this reason, is to bleed Russia, because they felt Russia stood in their way of bleeding China. And they've gotten their wish in reverse, because what they did, of course, was force Moscow and Beijing into a tacit alliance of sorts. So that failed majorly. The second reason was to make money. to make money for Lockheed Martin and all the other defense contractors who, believe me, have made a fortune off this war and off Gaza. So much of a fortune that they don't even have to have their CEOs buy their stocks back now in order to drive the prices up, because the market is just reacting to the fact that their profits are obscene off of this war. And there are other people who made money too. And then the third reason, and I even can see some validity to this reason, but it's third and not the paramount reason, was to stop China from doing what it wished to do with regard to its base road initiative in Europe. And what that was they have now, most people don't even know this. I've found only 3 people I've talked to in the last year that even were aware of this. China has built a rail network that debouches into Europe that takes 16 hours to get the produce from its Pacific ports into the heart of Europe, if it's allowed to function. That reduces their shipping time, if you will, which was overseas before through the Red Sea or through the Straits or whatever, by about 3 days. It's a monumental increase in ability to flood Europe with Chinese products. It takes about 16 hours on this rail. Well, that's been halted by this war, and China's turning Ukraine into an entrepot for Europe through which it funnels all of its goods into Europe, has been halted. So that was another strategic reason. I think that was, as I said, the lesser strategic reason, but one that sort of made some sense, but you could have done it in other ways.
Yeah.
You could have done it by asking Germany, for example, to help you, because they would be the formidable power in that regard at the time. Now, what we've done by blowing up Nord Stream pipeline, we've caused Germany to go from being one of the finest manufacturing countries in the world to being a basket case.
Yeah.
And they're just now realizing that, which is why the government's going to change forthwith. But those are the reasons, basically.
Would Nord Stream factor into that also? I mean, Blinken, if I'm not mistaken, wrote the book on pipeline wars, where they complained about that pipeline for years because they didn't necessarily like the connection between Russia and Germany. And to be honest, the fact that the pipeline exists at all kind of shows all of this stuff to be somewhat of a fraud. If Germany really believed that Russia was a threat, that all of these people are saying it was, they would have never had the pipeline. They would have never invested in it. But they needed the energy and everything else. But it didn't seem like the U.S. approved of that pipeline because of the connections between Russia and Germany. Was that part of I guess what I'm asking is, was the pipeline gravy on top, or was it part of the main objectives in regards to the conflict?
I think it was part of the main objectives. It was an act of terrorism, in my view, and under international law, it should be condemned. People should be held accountable. Of course, they won't be. But it also had, I listed 3 reasons. There's an overall economic reason for Ukraine and for the wider array of things we're doing to Europe, like bringing so many countries into NATO. Mm-hmm. And that reason is to reestablish our economic hegemony over Europe. It was slipping. And Germany was one of the powers taking it away from us, France to a lesser extent, but Germany majorly. I mean, they were in many respects, they were the first manufacturing country in the world, even outdoing China in terms of the skill and talent of their workforce and the productivity of that workforce. So Germany was a colossal threat to us in terms of productive capacity and economic might, and would only have gotten worse over time vis-a-vis us. So we had to reestablish our economic hegemony over Europe, and what better way than to bring them to their knees in our war?
Yeah, and we've deindustrialized one of our quote unquote allies. I remember Macron coming out asking the US, saying, hey, aren't we all in this together? Because they were paying 5 times more for energy than what they were paying at first, and it was eating into their industries.
Right. Plus, it's the gas, principally the gas methane is what it really is, that replaced the methane from Russia is a lot dirtier too.
Right.
More expensive and dirtier.
Just
so they insane. Got two curses.
I just can't, it shocked me that they would allow their own societies to take a hit like that. Like Annalena Baerbock coming out saying, I don't care what Germans want. We're going to support this war. And even coming out with this kind of honest assessment that, yeah, we had to, cut into our rail networks, we had to cut into our healthcare spending in order to give money to Ukraine. And I think to myself, that is outrageous. Like the idea that you would say that aloud is pretty shocking to me, but it gets across what was taking place in real terms in regards to what they were willing to give up on their local societies in order to fund and push this war. It's just astonishing to me. I'm curious on something else. From you have been in the room when, let's say, either wars or this kind of conversation about wars were taking place. Donald Trump has effectively said, I'm going to end this war. I'm going to end this war. He has made it one of his main campaign, let's say, thrust of his campaign speech. And I guess the question breaks down into two parts. Is it possible that what Joe Biden is doing is escalating in order to provoke some kind of crisis where he believes he'll be able to solve before Trump gets in office? I guess that's the first question. And I ask the second afterwards. But I'm curious on that front. Do you think this escalation is a larger plan at work with the idea of, I'm going to solve this now before Donald Trump gets in office and comes up with his own deal, and I'm going to do this by escalating in order to provoke a crisis? Or not so much? This is just Joe Biden being spiteful.
I think there may be some element of that to it, but it's insane from the perspective of the time remaining that anyone would conceive strategically, geopolitically, that this could be solved by the time Donald Trump takes the oath of office. It is not going to be solved. If it's going to be solved in a decisive way, it's going to be solved by Putin taking the gloves off. Right now, what you have in Ukraine is some very brave people who have been cut down to almost nothing, who are dying at numbers that are catastrophic. Manpower is the big issue in Ukraine right now, and Russia tops Ukraine by a factor of 10 or 12 to 1 in that regard. Artillery is the next factor, and Russia tops Ukraine about 50 to 1 in that regard, regardless of anything we might furnish them. They simply don't have the people and the artillery tubes to fire those artillery rounds as fast as the Russians can. So it's a disaster right now for the Ukrainians. And for that reason alone, sane people should stop this conflict, because we're just killing people for nothing.
Well, will the attack items make a difference? I mean, if Joe Biden is basically allowing these long-range strikes, would that make any difference on the battlefield? Is this a wonder weapon, as they call it?
The pressure, especially from around Moscow on Putin, is not pressure to end the conflict. It's pressure to end the conflict decisively on Russian terms.
Right.
And so this will anger that group in Moscow that has considerable power, that is putting pressure on Putin to end it quickly and get it over with. So, that's every invitation for Putin to push harder and to go, at least conventionally, the way I described earlier with the Avard system, or go nuclear.
Do you believe that Trump is going to end the war in the way he says he's going to end it?
I do. I think he's going to have a lot more trouble than he thinks, because he's the man of the deal. He's a transactional man, if nothing else.
Right.
And when he finds what Putin's deal, such as it is going to be, is at the negotiating table, he's going to be very difficult to deal with, and Putin is not going to tolerate that very long. And what I mean is, Putin is going to be very, very reluctant, even is not going to at all fall off the fact that he is going to invest all of the Russian-speaking provinces of Ukraine, and he is going to want to keep those, just as he wants to keep Crimea. Now, I think Trump could say, he has said, Crimea is yours. We're not disputing that. But it's going to be tough for any American president, and particularly Trump, to go to negotiations or have someone for him go to negotiations and have Putin act like that. Because Trump is going to want to say afterwards, I got the deal. I got the deal. And he's going to have a hard time doing that with Putin.
Well, considering facts on the ground, as they are, I don't know. Let me ask you this. what could Trump do? I mean, does Trump really have any assets in that region where he would be able to influence one way or the other in the context of a deal? I mean, because it seems like everything has been put on the field at this point. Russia has been going through NATO equipment like butter over the last several months. What could he do? It seems like it's a fait accompli on some level. If Trump negotiates, it seems like it's a loss either way, that Trump doesn't necessarily have any, let's say, feather in his cap, short of going to some kind of nuclear conflict where we're directly engaged, that could change the context of that negotiation in any particular way. But correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Well, I think he has some leverage, and I think the leverage is the weariness of Putin for this conflict. And the weariness, to a certain extent, of other Russians who aren't in that group that I just described to you.
Mhm.
And you might add the weariness of people being conscripted from all over Russia, because he's not drafting people from the Moscow area. He knows
Right.
that would be very, very difficult to do. Just as Zelensky's not drafting people from the Kiev area. They won't
Yeah.
serve. They're the sons and daughters of the nomenclatura, if you will, the cognoscenti, the high-ranking, high-moneyed people around Kiev. They won't let their sons and daughters serve. And that's causing Zelensky some problem, too. But it's causing Putin a problem in Russia, and he's going to run out of recruits from the hinterland, so to speak. So there are pressures that if Trump recognizes them and uses them subtly, or his negotiator does, they can come to a deal. I would love to be the negotiator myself, love to, because I think I know the points that we could agree on and the points that we would disagree on. And I think I know how to manage those latter. But
Go into that for me. Step into
is he
it.
going
What
to
are
have
the points?
someone who can do that?
Well, that's what's going to step into it for me. What are the points that we agree on? And what are the points? Well, obviously, let's start with that. What are the points that we agree on that you believe can mend fences where both, because at the end of the day, in agreements, usually both sides want to walk out saying, I got this. Basically, a
Or both.
face-saving mechanism for each side. What would that be?
Actually, I learned at State, I think, and I learned this lesson in the Pentagon too, because the Pentagon does more diplomacy than State does. That's the
Yeah.
reality of America and the empire. Military officers do more diplomacy than any foreign service officer. So I learned in both places that the best negotiations in a complex situation like this come out in a lose-lose, not a win-win. That is to say, you lose, he loses, but you both recognize there's no other outcome, and you minimize the loss on both sides. That's what this is going to take. One of the things that we can come in and admit to immediately is what I just described. Crimea is yours.
Yeah.
We're not contesting that. Second thing we can recognize is you get the territory that you currently occupy. Now we'll argue over how long you get it for. Do you get it in perpetuity, or do you get it for 10 years? And do we hold referenda during that time in which at least 55% of the people have to vote for affiliation with Russia, affiliation with Kiev, or neutrality?
Yeah.
All three of those options would be open. And then the next point that's going to be a bone of contention is you, the American president, have to be willing to eventually renounce any prospect of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. And the
That's
alternative
main.
to that,
Yeah.
the alternative to that is what I said 6 years ago about Ukraine, even back when Powell was Secretary of State: neutrality. That state begs, as Switzerland does, a position, geopolitical position of neutrality. It should be neutral. It is too dangerously placed in the heart of Europe. It
Right.
needs, and it's too big, and it's too rich potentially. It needs to be neutral. It should be neutral. So you have to come to some kind of conclusion about that. But the key factor with Putin is going to be not a member of NATO, not
Right.
even 20 years down the road,
Right.
because he doesn't trust us. He doesn't trust us. He thinks we're duplicitous with good reason. He thinks we're liars with good reason. And so he doesn't trust us. So each thing that you negotiate has to be something that he can feel in his hand that's real. It can't be something that's based on our word, because he knows our word is worthless.
Yeah, he has to be able to validate it in some way, especially after the Minsk agreements where, it
Yes.
was basically lied to. I'm curious on something else. If Trump does come in, and if Trump does want to end the war, let's take him at his word for the moment. There are going to be people who fundamentally disagree with this, right? Like the blob, as they call it. There are going to be elements of it that disagree with the president's policies. And just like in the last time Trump was in office, where I believe it was Afghanistan policy or Syrian policy, where the generals basically ignored Trump's orders on that. How you've seen this kind of mechanism at work. What are the forces? Is it possible for one man, even if it's the president, to do that, to take to change the orthodoxy, especially around a war that has been going on for the last 3 years that everybody seems to be thoroughly invested in? Is it possible for Trump to do that on his own? And what would be kind of the forces pushing back against him as he tries to do this?
My quick answer is no, it's not possible, and particularly not possible because you are appointing, apparently, as your prime cabinet officers, neoconservatives.
Right.
The most prominent of which are Pete Hegseth at Defense and Marco Rubio at State. They are both arch neoconservatives. So you're going to be fighting Rubio from the perspective of his desire to be president, to follow you and be president, and the things he's going to do as Secretary of State to, grease the road for that, and his neoconservatism. He wants a war with every country in Latin America, from Venezuela to Argentina. He wants a war with them. He wants to replace Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. He wants to replace Maduro in Venezuela. He wants to sweep the slate clean in Latin America. So he's going to be operating against you all along. And then Pete Hegseth, an unknown
that brings
factor.
Up a whole nother question. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that brings up a whole nother question then. If Donald Trump goes in and says, I'm going to end wars, not make them, then what does this cabinet tell you about if people are policy? What does this cabinet tell you about the policy that's coming up? I mean, especially if you believe that he's going to try to end the war in Ukraine, wouldn't the people that he's selecting indicate something else?
Tulsi Gabbard is the only member of his administration that seems to be anti-war,
right,
and smart, except with her remarks about Israel. There she troubles me greatly because she's in for a penny, in for a pound with Bibi Netanyahu, the mass murderer. But everyone else that he's put out so far is either a warmonger or a potential warmonger. Now, let me hasten to add, I don't think a single one of the currently announced cabinet officers will be in office 9 to 10 months down the road. I think he will have fired them all.
Now, you think he's going to fire all of them?
Absolutely.
Well, but why choose them if he's going to fire them later? Like, meaning, go for it.
He owes a certain debt to the Republican Party, not much, but a certain debt. And he's got to have, now that they own both houses of Congress, he's got to have some cooperation from them. So he's playing the game of these guys like Getz, and I owe this to Getz. I don't even think Getz will get confirmed. And I think Trump knows that. These guys like Rubio, so I'm paying them. These guys like Hegseth, so I'm paying them. And that's what he's doing, but he'll get rid of them within a year.
It feels like it's an Israel first government. I mean, Miriam Adelson gives them, well, supposedly $100 million. Apparently she only gave them 30 or 40 million.
Yeah.
But, Trump wants to, and just to transition just for a little bit. When Trump was in the first time around, Trump was able to isolate Iran and North Korea. Okay, but that's off the table at this point. Iran is not isolated anymore. Saudi Arabia and Iran have, at the very least, are not at each other's throats in the way that they were before, and both are under this kind of model of the BRICS, even if Saudi Arabia is not necessarily a full-fledged member. North Korea is in association with Russia from a standpoint of a security agreement. Iran would be in a security agreement with Russia at a certain point. So even if I accept that Donald Trump wants to come in and eliminate, let's say, hostilities with Russia, the pressure campaign against Iran, I don't know what that looks like when he comes in office, especially considering 90% of Iran's oil goes to China. How do you think that looks? How do you think, like, and I mean in real world terms, is that a war? Is that a pressure campaign, but I don't even know what a pressure campaign looks in that context when he doesn't necessarily have all of these states together in the way that they were the first time around, especially considering that all of these places at this point are angry at Israel. What does this look like when he comes in office in regard to the Middle East?
I don't know how he's going to square his affection, and that's the best term I can use, for Israel,
No.
and his debt to Israel and debt to Miriam, even though she only gave him 30 million,
Right.
and his desire not to have a war with Iran, because I think it's a genuine desire on Trump's part. I think he lines up with the current Pentagon in that regard. He does not want a war with Iran. But as you've pointed out, it's going to be extremely difficult. And let me just say that not only does China get lots of its oil from Iran, it gets lots of its oil from the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
It is the greatest benefactor of oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. So they are a tacit ally of Iran, too, if it looks like that oil flow is threatened. And don't you doubt that for a minute. The Chinese will be right there with the Russians supporting the Iranians if anybody formidable attacks them. Guarantee you. It's all about oil. So I don't know how he's going to square that. I would not want that challenge on my desk. That's a hell of a challenge, unless he just decides he wants to shut down Israel's wars too, and then calms the water, so to speak.
What concerns you most when you look at the world today? Like, meaning, if you had to pick one, either a flashpoint or some kind of strategic, well, not strategic, that's not the right word for it, but a flashpoint or something that is going on in the world that gives you the most concern. It could be pretty much, it could be domestic or international.
Well, there are two things that truly bother me at this end of my life. I'll be 80 next month. And the one is that we, the United States, the American empire, have dismantled on purpose every single nuclear weapons treaty in the world, every single one of them. And we did that so that we could spend over $1.5 trillion in the next decade or so. And Obama, in his nuclear posture statement, started this to modernize, suretize, and securitize, we call it, our nuclear weapon stockpile, so we can take on not only Russia, but also China in combination. That's what we're building out to do. This is extremely dangerous. We're courting a new nuclear arms race, and we're courting nuclear war. And the second thing that truly troubles me, and I'm not even talking about the climate crisis, we are in such colossal debt right now that about the only way we could have even a fathom of hope in getting out of it in a way that is successful for our imperial designs is a huge war. And we did that to a certain extent in World War I, and we did that to a certain extent in World War II. We did it aggressively in World War II. We did it on the sly in World War I. We loaned everybody money that they had to pay back to us at incredible interest rates. And we became very, very wealthy, thank you very much. And Britain and France became very, very poor, thank you very much, not to mention Germany. World War II, of course, we came out of it top of the world. 51% of the world's GDP, all of our competitors at our feet, broken, torn apart, including the Soviet Union, Japan, Germany, Britain. So since that time, we have genuinely been really the world hegemon, certainly even counting the Soviet Union, because they never were as strong as everybody said they were. We just did that to keep our budgets up. Now we are busted. We are $50.2 trillion in aggregate debt in 11 years, according to the CBO. We're $30 trillion right now. If you sold every hard asset in America, bridges, buildings, roads, everything that's hard and could be valued, you would only get about 50 trillion. So we owe our country. We owe our country. Our GDP percentage debt is 120% of GDP. We have never been at this point except in war. Never. And I don't know how we correct it, because we aren't going to win this, quote, war, unquote. We simply aren't. They're going to
Well,
beat us eventually because the world is moving right now. BRICS is the manifestation of it to
right.
balance us, and they're sick of us. BRICS combined GDP is $60.2 trillion. They are going to stomp us, and we are going to be stomped internally by the fact that we owe so much money that when they come up with an alternative method of paying their debts and their costs, which they are doing, we're
Yeah.
going to find ourselves holding a currency that is also bankrupt. So
Oh,
those things really worry me.
that is a fascinating point. I guess this will be the last question. Vladimir Putin was given a speech, and in that speech, he kind of mentioned this notion of like the strategic aims of the dollar, and he pointed out that the U.S. is making money out of thin air, and that if you have like $10 trillion that are just spun into existence, imagine what you could do with $10 million, $10 trillion. Like you could use that money for anything if you could just make it out of thin air. And that was the point that he was kind of making. He was like, they've been able to use the reserve currency in a way where they've been able to advantage themselves to the tune of trillions of dollars that a normal country wouldn't necessarily be able to do. And part of the BRICS thought process was that the moment that you get countries where they can have deals done in their own reserve currency, you're no longer stuck with that liability of the dollar. It can't be used as a weapon. It can't hit you. But it also means that those dollars are now back at home without basically, it becomes inflationary. All of this money, the rest of the world is no longer using. So even it may have the reserve currency, at this point it's down to 50%. At one point it was at 70%. Okay, what does that look like at 30% when many of these countries around the world just come together and say, okay, well, we're using our own currency for the majority of these deals? We collapse. Meaning those are like, I guess what I'm pointing out, you're absolutely right. There's a strategic edge to the way that we use money and the way we use our dollar. And the rest of the world is coming together, realizing it, and it's trying to find a way to basically avoid it because of the way we've used it as a weapon going forward. I guess they don't know that though. Like certainly the Democratic Party didn't bring up BRICS once. And I remember Trump, at the very least, had some awareness of it where he pointed out, hey, it looks like those countries are coming together against us. And he points it out in the context of sanctions, saying, I'm going to get rid of these sanctions. It's hurting the dollar. It's hurting the dollar. And even going so far as to say he's going to go after countries that are de-dollarizing, which is just going to hasten the downpour, the spiral on that. Do you have any hope or any sort of, I guess, impression that this changes, that we turn a corner in this country? I don't see it. And I guess I'm wondering, you've been around this on this planet longer than I have. You've seen upheavals and downturns in regards to this country. Do you see an out for this? Do you see a corner that we're going to turn on this issue?
First, let me say you just answered your own question better than I can with your explanation of what's going on. And no, I don't, the history, the 3,000 years that we know about with some detail of empires, from the very beginning to the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Mughal, the Mongol, the Ottoman, the British, on whom the sun never set. At the end, they all went bankrupt. They all went bankrupt. And they did so in various ways, usually through overextension and wars and things like that. But we're doing it in a unique sort of way, and we're doing it with the most incredible technological development in human history, nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we will go quietly into that dark night. We may start the nuclear war ourselves, because what you just described is going to happen with such a vengeance and so quickly that the American people will be stunned, and so will the leadership, and we'll look for somebody to start the war with to save ourselves.
Is this just hubris? Like when I look at these people and the things that they say and do, unprovoked war in Ukraine, it's like, okay, well, that's just dishonest. They have to clearly know that that's dishonest. Putin is going to take all of Europe. And when Putin comes out and says, I need security guarantees, you're effectively surrounding me. I need security guarantees. And nobody would do or work with him at all It was weird. All of them came out and effectively said, Russia doesn't get security guarantees. You don't get to say that. Is it because the fall of the Soviet Union and the US just looked at it like all of these mini Fukuyamas? Well, we clearly just won this. And because we won, you don't really get to tell us your concerns, where it takes this kind of test of strength in order to say, oh, okay, we do need to pay attention to their concerns. Is this just hubris from the leaders in Europe and the US, or is something else going on with this? And this will be the last question.
No, I think it is hubris and arrogance, but it's a hubris and arrogance brought about by some of the things you just described, the most potent of which I think is the fact that we thought they were done. We thought they were toast. And when we try to put a fork in them, as it were, they weren't.
They weren't done.
And so psychologically speaking, we're reeling from our own mistake, our own misjudgment, our own miscalculation. And that is probably one of the most dangerous things that can happen to empire.
Wow.
You look at the Persian, for example, which many historians would say was the most powerful empire in human history, and how they went out. And you say, well, that was all about hubris. It was all about thinking that they could not be defeated, thinking that their armies were impregnable, invincible, and so forth. And remember, they went up to the Greeks, and the little Greeks handed them a defeat. And of course, Alexander handed them lots of subsequent defeats. So you get to that point where the hubris just outweighs reasonable thinking, and certainly it outweighs wisdom. And we reached the apex of that with Joe Biden.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I can't tell if when William Burns made the memo, "Net means net," and he very clearly, very prescient, spelled all of this out.
Niet means no. Niet
means net. That's right. No means no. And like when you read the document, you think to yourself, okay, this is so clearly explained, and yet they ran headlong into it. And I can't tell whether they ran headlong into it on purpose with the idea of creating a Hobbes choice. Basically, either you allow us to militarily surround you, or you take military action where we try to destroy your economy and try to destroy your military. Or they sleptwalk into it, kind of like in the First World War. I can't tell which one it is.
I think it's more of the former. I don't think we sleptwalk into this. I think we created it.
Ran into it. Yeah. Colonel, man, thank you for this. I deeply appreciate it. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He is Distinguished Visiting Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. He also taught 6 years at the University Honors Program at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., right here. He also, and is probably best known as retired United States Army Colonel and former Chief of Staff for U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal.
All right. We have come to the end of the road, or at the very least, the end of the show. Let's get these chats in. And first, let's fix my banner. Where's my banner? Where's my banner? Okay, where's my banner? Something's wrong. I'm sorry. I'm trying to fix something. Oh, there we are. All right. And this.